Hi, I'm Robert Tolby, and today I'm talking about a narrative that just won't die. That Starbucks-sipping white women are the main culprits of gentrification. We've all seen that meme of the white BLM e-girl moving next door to a black tenant, and the Whole Foods crops up, and then the Starbucks gets built, and then the black tenant gets an eviction notice. Memes like this communicate who public enemy number one is in the fight against gentrification. Upper middle class female influencers, of course. Them, and less commonly, their man-bunned male counterparts, are the ones being roasted on your Twitter timeline for being a gentrifier, the noun that is synonymous with these young white people who buy up housing formerly occupied by black people. Of course, these people are complicit in gentrification, but blaming them almost entirely for gentrification in this way is unproductive. By coining a term which points to white renters as being the perpetrators of gentrification, you place the blame on individuals for a systemic issue and direct blame away from much more powerful people and causal factors, such as developers, corporate landlords, and a shortage of housing. But the word gentrifier has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? And having a guilty party gives you someone to shout at. Because you can't exactly shout at a housing shortage now, can you? Unfortunately, shouting at white renters does nothing, as the forces at play which are causing these renters to displace people of color continue onward. So what are these forces and how do we stop them? The discussion of gentrification has become so far removed from the causes of gentrification that even academics who study it are becoming distracted by its mere aesthetic. In a paper titled The Eviction of Critical Perspectives from Gentrification Research, Tom Slater, an urban geographer and professor at Columbia University, sounds the alarm about a shift in the image of gentrification. The perception is no longer about rent increases, landlord harassment, and working class displacement, but rather street-level spectacles, trendy bars and cafes, iPods, social diversity, and funky clothing outlets. Slater warns that this perception of gentrification is dangerous because it associates gentrification with things that are appealing. I mean, who doesn't like lattes and funky clothing outlets? Because of this shift in people's view of gentrification, people might mistake it for a good thing. To some, gentrification is the revitalization of decrepit urban neighborhoods, lacking in creativity and culture. But as Slater points out, this is merely people co-opting a word which is inherently critical of the negative effects of the middle class moving into urban areas to describe things which gentrification is not. Slater states that available evidence shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that gentrification is not a quick fix for what people call urban decay, and it is not the antithesis of all the multifaceted issues facing cities around the world. It is the uprooting of communities and part of the initiation of a housing crisis. But most people know that already. That's not what I'm arguing in this video. The question they ask is not whether gentrification is bad, but they ask, who do I blame for it? As public perception of gentrification is tied closely to lattes and trendy clothing shops, I've noticed that it has become feminized in the eyes of the public, and thus some anti-gentrification sentiment has become tied with misogyny. Anger at the creation of a feminized consumer paradise in historically diverse working class neighborhoods has become anger at yuppie white women. Soon, our Twitter timelines became filled with tweets about aspiring young white female influencers who are purportedly gentrifiers. Half of these people being absolutely crucified have 2 or so followers. I mean, who even is this young woman? When I was scrolling through all the quote tweets telling her to go die, I came across this surprisingly lucid tweet. Like, what is the importance of the person in this video? This tweet was seen 70 times more than the original TikTok. What are we doing here? What are people doing here? While the original Twitter user who left this tweet was simply expressing her frustration about some annoying transplant complaining about her hometown, a small section of Twitter decided to turn this young woman into the quintessential gentrifier of the hour, who they could take out their frustration on. This kind of thing seems to occur in the same corner of the internet in which the blatantly misogynistic meme I showed earlier was proliferated. The reason why many in this space have largely ignored their own misogyny is because while hating women in general is considered to be super uncool, reframing your hatred of women as anger at specifically white women's prejudiced behavior allows you to get away with making all sorts of misogynistic comments. A lot of leftist men these days have hijacked the valid criticisms made predominantly by Black women, so when they want to call a woman an overly emotional crazy lady, which wouldn't fly, they just call that woman a Karen shedding white woman tears and get away with it. This is why when you want to call a woman a gentrifier bitch, you gotta throw the word white in there to make that completely okay. Now, white women are not the victims of gentrification activism. That's stupid, and I'm not trying to say that. I'm also not trying to say that all people angry about gentrification, or even all people angry at white women renting once affordable apartments formerly occupied by Black tenants, are sexists who have no idea how gentrification works. I'm trying to point out that a narrow segment of chronically online people are engaging in discourse that is not productive and probably in part driven by misogyny. So if white women aren't gentrification demons cursing Black neighborhoods with their mere presence, what is causing gentrification? Unfortunately, pointing at direct causal factors isn't easy, but there are a few factors that may have resulted in gentrification of many neighborhoods. One factor is U.S. housing policy. In the 1990s, policies aimed at improving housing conditions and reducing the concentration of poverty resulted in the demolition of high-rise apartment complexes in disrepair and the displacement of their tenants. Instead of building affordable housing in place of these complexes, much more expensive, less dense housing was built. Urban development projects implemented by cities created trendy, amenity-rich environments. The new housing and amenities attracted millennials with deeper pockets, who moved into these units that were no longer affordable to the residents who had lived in these neighborhoods for generations. This, of course, is highly simplified, and I'm hardly an economist or sociologist, so I can't tell you much beyond that. But the national housing shortage is a huge part of the story of gentrification. Housing is expensive, in part because there's not enough of it. But more housing doesn't get built because the rich people in cities don't want the poors living in their backyard. These NIMBYs, which is an acronym for adherence to the not in my backyard philosophy of housing, are the people taking over zoning commission meetings to make sure high-rises never get built next door to their multi-million-dollar homes. These are not young gentrifying renters, these are boomer property owners. Some critics have called these people the real villains of the gentrification story. Writing for The Atlantic, Jerusalem Demsas comments on how these wealthy property owners fade into the background even as their interests are defended by nearly every institution and elected official. Of course, as Demsas points out, predominantly white, young, and college-educated people buying up affordable housing is a problem. But in focusing on this narrow framing of the situation, we're ignoring the structural problems that are nudging individuals towards the behaviors that are destroying communities. It's also worth noting that purported gentrifiers may be displacing communities, but this is not because they have pernicious motives and hate people of color. Most are likely aware that they're a part of gentrification, but are largely politically in favor of policies that would result in the construction of affordable housing. Policies that would undoubtedly mitigate the harmful effects of gentrification. Perhaps the demographic which has become the face of gentrification may be able to help and stop it. Among these 20 to 30-somethings, there's a rising YIMBY movement, or Yes in My Backyard movement, of people who want more housing to be built. They confront those in power who are blocking the construction of affordable housing. Alas, people's surface-level understanding of gentrification as an aesthetic might undermine this effort by duping the internet into thinking that affordable housing is causing gentrification, which it's not. Jerusalem Demsas has written about this as well in an article where she explains that the ugly cuboid buildings that have become emblematic of the gentrification of cities are actually mitigating the problem of displacement by creating more housing that people can afford. These buildings look the way they do because they're built cheaply, such that ordinary people can afford to rent their units. But instead of evaluating what is really taking place, gentrification has been transformed by a small group of people on social media into a simple story with a clear villain and an easy to identify appearance. Because of this, unproductive discussions and Twitter threads about random white people, especially white women who hold very little power or are of no importance in the grand scheme of things, are the ones who get all the blame for gentrification, while the structures in place and the people who want to keep things the way they are remain unnoticed. If any productive discussion is to be had about gentrification, we have to dismantle the oversimplified tropes associated with gentrifiers and take a look at the bigger picture. Anyways, I'm Robert Tolpe, and for the price of 2 gentrifier lattes a year, you can show your support by being one of my patrons on Patreon. And don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Bye-bye!